I'm Gillian Findlay. Tonight on The Fifth Estate. It's the kind of crime that's not supposed to happen in small-town Canada.
We have a complete lockdown of 2 townships. People have been told to stay in their homes, lock the doors.
3 women picked off one by one. One of the worst incidents of domestic violence in Canadian history.
He said, "She's dead." And I have never felt such anger.
The suspect, known to the women, known to everyone, and for years known as violent.
Everyone was afraid of him. I was certainly afraid of him. The neighbors were afraid of him.
So why did it happen?
We saw this man coming, and the system did nothing.
How did the system supposed to protect women end up failing them so badly?
Something's wrong with our justice system. Something's wrong with people who didn't realize he's a serious offender when for years he's been beating women. Like, why didn't we know?
Renfrew County in the Ottawa Valley. Sprawling, peaceful, conservative. The kind of place that values community, but also privacy. A place where other people's business is often left well enough alone. It was here in the summer of 2005 that Frank and Natalie Warmerdam moved from Toronto with their 2 young children.
We had both grown up in the country, so she grew up here in Renfrew County and I grew up on a farm as well. So we kind of wanted to give some of that life to the kids.
It was a perfect place to raise a family, and Natalie in particular loved it. Watching her children grow, along with her collection of farm animals. Her daughter, Valerie, 18 now, could never imagine her mother anywhere else.
She loved the colors in the fall. She loved the house had its issues, but she loved that it was a gorgeous house. Cold, but gorgeous. Hard to maintain, but beautiful. So yes, this was her dream property, for sure.
In the city, she'd worked as a software writer. But as the children grew older, Natalie yearned for more meaningful work. At the age of 35, she went back to school to become a nurse.
It's not that easy in the sort of middle of life to make such a decision and go back and spend several years. But you know, she went for it, and I was really proud of that.
Her new career was as a palliative care nurse, traveling the county to care for the dying. But in 2010, it was Natalie's marriage that was dying. Frank was leaving, and even though he'd remained close to the family, Natalie's world turned upside down.
It sent her reeling. She was lost for a while.
Tracy McBain was Natalie's closest friend and confidant.
And I don't blame her. I mean, it's very difficult when you see your life going one way and all of a sudden it does a sharp 180 and you don't know what to do. So it was extraordinarily difficult.
Bruised, confidence gone, Natalie was vulnerable. When into her life walked a new man, Basil Barutsky. He was a friend at first, charming, helpful around the house. But before anyone knew it, Barutsky had moved into Natalie's house. Everything about him made her friends worry, especially his drinking.
I initially chalked it up to, it's a first meeting, you're meeting her dear friend, it can be nerve-wracking. So I kind of chalked it up to maybe first nerves. After that, not so much.
The Barutsky family had been in Renfrew County for generations. Strong, self-reliant. That was their reputation. But Basil always had a different one, according to neighbor Peter Langbet.
Basil had always been somewhat of a bully in school, and he was not just one of those guys who blends in. And, you know, we've heard through other people that have known him throughout his life that one day he was going to get himself into some trouble.
His first conviction for violence was in 1977, assault causing bodily harm. In the years that followed, there would be other complaints, threats, alcohol charges, a growing pattern of belligerence. Barutsky was that guy you didn't want to cross, says John Dixon. He still remembers a day in 2011 that was made perfectly clear to everyone.
We went over, and all around Basil's entranceway in snowbanks, he had stuffed signs fastened to stakes of wood. And I could be wrong, but I thought I counted 27.
27 signs on fences, on tree trunks, names of neighbors, police officers, anyone who'd crossed him. All enemies now, warned to stay away.
One big sign listed maybe 15 to 20 people that were not allowed on his property. His wife, Mary Ann, was listed in there.
Mary Ann Barutsky predated Natalie Warmerdam by decades. 4 times over the course of her 26-year relationship with Basil Barutsky, he was charged with assaulting her. The first time, he was acquitted by the courts. The second and third times, the charges never made it to trial. After the 4th charge was dropped, Mary Ann obtained a court order requiring him to stay away from her. But because none of the charges resulted in convictions, there was no public record of Barutsky's alleged violence. No way for Natalie Warmerdam's family to know his real history beyond rumors.
My grandmother basically said, stay away from him, and my mom didn't listen.
Why did your grandmother say that? Do you know?
Because she'd heard about bad things with him and his ex-wife.
I actually got a private investigator do a background check, see if there was a lot of, a criminal record that might be worth bringing up, but that didn't bring up much beyond what was already known about the DUIs and stuff like that, so.
The allegations didn't just come from his ex-wife. In 2010, another woman brought a charge against Basil Barutsky for criminal harassment. We don't know the details because, once again, at the last moment, the charge was dropped. By now, there seemed to be a pattern about how Barutsky treated women, but with no convictions on his record for decades, Natalie refused to see a problem.
She very much believed that if the law hasn't found something wrong, then you can't treat someone wrong because they were charged and not convicted. You innocent until proven guilty. Except when people are too afraid to go forth and prove him guilty, well, what are you supposed to do?
Initially, Natalie bought what Barutsky told her. His ex-wife was crazy, the other women out to get him. If there was a victim, it was always him. All she wanted to do was help.
She really truly believed that we can lift all of us up. And it's a beautiful thing to believe. We want to be able to do that. But if someone won't take the help that's being offered, well, as they say, a drowning man will drag you under if you try to help him. So in this situation, she found a drowning man.
By the spring of 2012, that was becoming apparent even to Natalie.
Outbursts of anger, the drinking, general belligerence. It was just becoming an ugly situation.
And did she feel afraid?
Yes, she did.
Valerie was scared too.
There had been about a week where she had been trying to basically tell him that they were done. He wouldn't leave. So she had moved into the guest room, and he'd keep her up late at night screaming at her about how he wanted half of her stuff because they were common law partners in theory. She went and talked to a neighbor, and the neighbor basically told her, this is an abusive relationship, and that you need to get you and especially the kids out of this situation.
It was concern for the kids that convinced Natalie to go to police that summer. Barutsky had assaulted her, she told them, and was threatening everyone.
At one point, he threatened to kill Mom's dog. He threatened to skin my brother if he ever caught the damn boy. That's my understanding of it.
He also threatened Mary Ann, his ex-wife. By now, they'd been separated for years, but there were charges pending from the time they were together.
He threatened that if Mary Ann ever successfully put him in jail, told my mom not to wait for him because when he got out, he'd kill her and go back. That was one of the biggest things that had Mom afraid, because then she put him in jail. So does the threat apply to her too?
But it was not assault that would land him in jail. Like Marianne's charges, Natalie's assault charge was dropped. In return, Borutsky pleaded guilty to some of the threats and was sentenced to 5 months. The prosecutor argued for a longer sentence, but as the judge pointed out, Borutsky hadn't been convicted of a violent crime since 1977. What that didn't take into account, because under our legal system it can't, was the number of times women had by then brought charges against Basil Borutsky, only to have them dropped or negotiated away. Natalie was relieved at the plea deal. It meant she wouldn't have to testify against him in court. But it also meant Borutsky would be out sooner. In recognition of the time he'd spent in jail waiting for his trial, after his conviction, he served just 33 days. He was ordered to have no contact with Natalie. Authorities were sufficiently worried they offered her a small electronic device to wear, a panic button.
It looked like a pager. It was a little black box. It had GPS in it, so it could tell them where she was. I think that may have been around the time that she bought herself a shotgun, just in case he ever showed up.
She did install security cameras in the house as a precaution. She did everything right, but she was still afraid.
When we come back, the circle of fear widens.
I said to her, he seems to be stalking you.
By 2013, Basil Borutsky was back in Renfrew County. He'd gone to jail for threatening Natalie Warmerdam and her family, served 5 months, and was on probation. Among the terms of his probation was that he lived with a friend near the town of Wilno, 35 kilometers away from Natalie, but as it would turn out, close to another woman he'd met years before, Anastasia Kuzik.
She acted as his real estate agent, selling his property, and she and a boyfriend rented his house and lived in his house for a while.
Laura Kuzik is Anastasia's sister. The real estate career paid the bills, she says, but it was never her passion. This was.
She loved horses, absolutely. Horses were her passion and her heart.
She rode competitively and did well. The year before, she'd been a provincial champion.
You know, she loved being with animals. She just loved nature and being outside.
But 2013 was turning out to be a tough year for Anastasia. The relationship with her boyfriend turned nasty and ended. She bought an old farmhouse, but discovered it needed more work than she'd bargained for, or could afford, according to her mother, Sirpa.
That winter of 2013 was extremely difficult. She had run out of firewood. You know, she was really struggling financially. And she said, a friend has come over, a friend.
The friend, a man who said he could help with all of it, Basil Borutsky, fresh out of jail. Once again, a vulnerable woman, an offer of help. Within days, Basil had moved in with Anastasia. A flagrant violation of his probation, but if Anastasia was aware of it, it didn't seem to bother her.
He had at one point been charged by his ex-wife. The former girlfriend had charged him, and he'd been convicted of making threats. How much of that did she know?
I think she knew some of it. She did tell me at one point that she trusted Basil. So he, at some point, convinced Stacia that he was innocent.
Innocent. Once again, he was the victim of vengeful women. But then came the night of December 30th. As Anastasia would later testify in court, it was a brutal beating that went on most of the night.
He
kept hitting me, and I was begging him to kill me. It hurt so much. My face was very sore, very battered up. And he wanted me to stop talking, and he kept holding my mouth, and he had his hands around my throat, like pressing.
She couldn't say what started the attack, just that Borutsky's eyes turned black, empty, and that at the end of it, she didn't recognize her own face.
He said that it wasn't me. He said it was the other women that I'd taken the beating for, the other women who had wrecked his life.
Like so many victims of domestic violence, Anastasia was initially reluctant to testify against her attacker,
That he had badly beaten.
her older sister, Ava.
I do believe Stace was afraid. I really do believe she was.
Afraid she wouldn't be believed, afraid of repercussions. Ironically, it would be Natalie Warmerdam, Borutsky's most recent victim, who would convince Anastasia to stand strong. The two women had come to know each other, and while Natalie's assault charge against Borutsky had been dropped, she was determined that Anastasia's would go ahead.
Mom was like, if we don't put him in jail, other women won't know that he's a danger, and so this is going to happen again and again and again. It's not legal to beat somebody. So we need to be, giving the court something to work with.
Borutsky was found guilty of assaulting and choking Anastasia, sentenced to 17 months. But once again, the judge couldn't take into consideration all those earlier charges against him that didn't result in convictions. By now, Borutsky had been identified by at least 4 women as being violent towards them. And yet, after credit for time served, this time he'd be out in just 5 months. When he was released, his probation order included a specific clause that he have no communication with nor go anywhere near Anastasia Kuzak. Borutsky refused to sign. The judge had also ordered him to attend a therapy program called Living Without Violence. Mike Richard is a counselor at the program. When he received Borutsky's file, he says his gut dropped.
All my alarm bells went off. I felt that there should be a review, high-risk review, held for him. That includes respect.
Richard has worked with a lot of abusers over the years. What had his alarm bells ringing was the description of Borutsky's attack on Anastasia.
The ferocity, the ferociousness of his attack. It wasn't a kind of situation where we would classify it as situational abuse. There was something much more serious taking place.
The review Richard wanted would have included Borutsky's probation officer and police, but it never happened. Having been ordered by the courts to attend the program, Borutsky didn't show up. An email was sent to the probation office, but Richard heard nothing more.
I mean, if somebody doesn't show up, what should happen?
They should be breached, or at least some kind of a review of that person's situation.
To your knowledge, did anybody follow this up? When you sent that email to say he didn't show, did anybody follow up on that? Do you know?
I don't know.
If there was follow-up, there's no record Borutsky was ever sanctioned for that probation violation, nor for many of his others. At one point, he'd been forced to forfeit his driver's license, and yet he was driving. He'd been told to stay out of the township where Natalie lived, and yet he actually convinced his probation officer to allow him access, ostensibly to attend that anti-violence program. When Natalie found out, she filed a complaint.
It's right near where she works, and she was very unhappy with that, but they're like, hey, we gotta help this guy, do better, right? Which is, in theory, a good thing.
But when she would raise it with the authorities...
They knew it was a problem, and there was very little that they could do, especially because the parole officer had allowed it.
Natalie started to worry again.
She was in the habit of backing into parking spots so she could leave quickly if, for example, he showed up where she was. And she had a tactical pen in her purse so she could defend herself.
But at least Natalie knew he was in the community. Anastasia, who'd been responsible for Borutsky's most recent incarceration, was never told he'd been released.
No, Stacia.
Not according to her sister, who was living with her at the time.
I really do think that Stace believed he was still in jail.
If he'd been out of jail, would that have been a concern to her?
Yes, I believe it would have been. We had been warned from Natalie before that Natalie had a panic button, and so I had definitely some concerns.
So did their other sister, Laura. She testified at Barutsky's trial. She was afraid of him, too.
Nobody told me that he was out of jail.
Do you think somebody should have?
Absolutely, without any doubt. We should have been told he was out of jail.
But as winter of 2015 turned to spring, with no further sightings of Basil Barutsky, everyone's tension levels started to subside. Natalie was in a new relationship, ready to move on.
She kind of figured if there was going to be a time that she would be in danger, it'd be in the first few months after he got out of jail. So after that time passed, she was not anywhere near as afraid.
Ex-husband Frank also breathed a sigh. By now, he'd relocated to California.
I had sort of come to the assumption that time had passed and that the crisis was past, so I had really stopped worrying about it too much.
As for Barutsky, he'd moved as well. Unemployed, getting by on disability payments for a bad back, he was now living in another part of Renfrew County, a town called Palmer Rapids, right next door to Cheryl Rossler.
Very nice guy. He brought me meals and that he cooked, and he made baked goods. He was like, he even planted a whole frig of strawberry plants underneath my picture window.
In return, Cheryl let Barutsky use her car. And last summer, he was using it a lot, driving with a suspended license to a lake on the edge of Renfrew County, Kaministiquia Lake. Specifically to this cottage. The cottage was owned by Carol Culluton, a soon-to-be retired civil servant from Ottawa. Hers would be the next life Basil Barutsky would insinuate himself into.
Oh, she had a great sense of humor, and she just loved to be with everybody.
But Carol was also vulnerable, says longtime friend Teresa Wallace. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, and she was having to sort out a future on her own.
She had a lot of anxiety, you know, wanting to put everything into financial perspective and knowing she was going to be retiring.
Central to Carol's plan was selling the cottage, but first she had to fix it up. That's where Barutsky came in, once again peddling his skills as a handyman. Every time Carol went to the lake, he was there. One day he actually showed up at her house in Ottawa, a 2-hour drive away.
She wasn't sure how he got her address or anything else. I said to her, he seems to be stalking you. And she said, that's what somebody else had said too.
Nevertheless, one day after her retirement party, Carol headed back to the cottage. She had a meeting scheduled with a real estate agent for Tuesday, September 22nd.
I did ask her if it was safe for her to go up to the cottage by herself. And she said yes. He was well aware that, she wanted nothing to do with him, and she didn't see any imminent danger.
How differently things might have turned out if she had. At the same time Carol was preparing to move on from Renfrew County, Basil Barutsky was having long conversations with his neighbors and making what even they thought was a strange request.
He did ask me one time to ask my boyfriend if he knew of anybody that would sell him a gun. I just felt uneasy about the subject. That's why I never brought it up to my boyfriend, even though he was asking me if he knew of anybody that would sell him one.
When we come back, September 22nd.
My sister phoned my cell phone and she said, Basil's at the house with a gun.
Tuesday, September 22nd was a cloudless, perfect fall day, Renfrew County at its finest. But the autumn's beauty was lost on 57-year-old, recently released prisoner, Basil Barutsky. Something was bothering him, according to his neighbor, Cheryl Rossler.
Didn't sleep the night before, was what he told me, and you could see the anger in his eyes, his face. He was hurting.
Hurting, Barutsky told her, because of Carol Colletton. He'd been working at her cottage and, according to what he told people, was in a relationship with her. Except now Carol was rejecting him, and he was mad.
I could tell that night he was going to snap.
Early the next morning, before Cheryl was even up, her car was gone. Police would later find the car 24 kilometers northwest of Palmer Rapids at a lake called Kameniskeg. It would be parked in the drive outside Carol Colletton's cottage. Carol's friend, Teresa Wallace, had been worried about her being at the cottage alone. All that morning, she'd been trying to reach her.
I had called her earlier, and then finally I started sending texts at 9:23. And 9:50, I wasn't hearing from her. I said, call me when you get my message.
She never heard back. Later that morning, a real estate agent arrived at the cottage with a friend. But there was no sign of Carol, no sign of anything. Except the front door appeared to have been kicked in. Realtor Kathy Pitts.
I walked into the bedroom and thought that there was no one there until I was about ready to go, and the gentleman with me had said, well, is there anybody here? And I said, no, but there was a body by my foot.
It was Carol. She'd been strangled. Nothing seemed to be missing except for Carol's vehicle. The car Barutsky had borrowed from his neighbor that morning was still in the drive, but now Carol's was gone. From Kameniskeg Lake to the town of Wilno, it's another 25 kilometers northeast, another half-hour drive. Wilno is where Anastasia Kuzik lived. In September, her sister was visiting. Ava Kuzik was upstairs that morning when she heard shouts.
I heard screaming, and Stacia had already been attacked by him. I think he had already done something to Stacia.
It's Basil, Anastasia yelled. As Ava ran towards her, she says she saw Barutsky through a window. He had a gun.
I was very, very close to where he was with the gun. He could have turned around and shot at me, but he must have been focusing on shooting my sister, and I ran for my life. He had the gun like that. He was walking very quickly, and within 2 or 3 seconds, I heard him shoot.
As soon as she felt safe, she called 911. Her second call was to her other sister, Lara.
She said, Basil's at the house with a gun. And I ran over to Mom's. We got in the car, we came over to Stacia's house, and the policeman said she's dead. And
By 9 a.m., reports of a shooter on the loose were spreading throughout the county. Police descended on Wilno from 3 different townships, as did emergency response units that by coincidence had been training in a park nearby.
We have a complete lockdown of 2 townships. People have been told to stay in their homes, lock the doors. All the schools are locked down, the children are being held.
Among those locked down at the high school was Natalie Warmerdam's daughter, Valerie.
It's hold and secure, they called it. So we were allowed to walk around inside the school, but no one was allowed to exit. So we basically sat around all period doing nothing, so thinking about why would we be in a hold and secure?
By now, the news had spread even to California, where Frank Warmerdam was checking headlines on his computer.
Strangely, I had seen a Globe and Mail article about a shooting in Wilno that morning, and I had been hitting reload, and there were some new details.
Frank had a bad feeling. His ex-wife Natalie's home wasn't far from Wilno, another 26 kilometers east, another 30-minute drive. Frank was worried. Where was Natalie? And where were the kids? Back at the school, Valerie was called to the principal's office. Something had happened, he told her, but no one had been hurt. Her next conversation was with the police.
And the police came in and sat me down and said, I'm sorry, but hate to have to say this, but your mother is deceased. Of course, that really surprised me because the principal had said that he didn't think anyone had been hurt. So I was rather in shock for a little while.
Did they tell you what had happened?
They really didn't have any details at that time.
The one person who did know what had happened was Valerie's brother, 20-year-old Adrian. He was home that morning with his mother. He's still too upset to tell us what he saw that day, but he did tell Valerie.
He said he heard Mom screaming, and then she ran past him, and he saw, I believe as he described it, was a big blur of a man shape carrying a gun. And that's when he knew something was seriously wrong, and he ran outside. He didn't even have shoes with him.
It was as Adrian was running outside that he heard the gun go off.
Did he know what had happened?
I think he assumed. He certainly didn't go back into the house. He stayed far away from the house until the police found him.
For an hour and a half, Adrian would hide in the woods on his cell phone with an open line to 911. He was alone, afraid to come out in case he'd be next. When police finally located him, Adrian was pretty sure he knew who shot his mother. But by then, everyone else was pretty sure too.
My sister called and she said, the kids are okay. I already had an impression what it'd be about. It was like this nightmare from the past had come back when you thought you didn't have to worry about it anymore.
By the afternoon, police were in full deployment at Carol Clutton's lakeside cottage. That's where they discovered the car that Basil Barutsky had borrowed from Cheryl Rosler. At 1:56, Rosler received a text from Barutsky. Your car is at the cottage. Sorry. I left $100 on the console for gas. Bye, friend. When Cheryl replied, she never heard back. By then, the hunt for Barutsky was county-wide. Buildings he'd had any connection with were locked down. People whom he'd threatened over the years, located and taken to secure places. By 2 o'clock, police had tracked his cell phone to a wooded suburb of Ottawa. He came out with his hands up. September 22nd would end with 3 women dead. Basil Barutsky back in custody, this time charged with murder.
Hello.
When we come back.
You have a collect call from Basil Barutsky.
It is estimated that worldwide, 1 out of every 3 women has been or will be a victim of domestic violence. 20 years ago, Canada joined the world in declaring it a global pandemic and promising to eradicate it. And yet, even in sparsely populated areas like Renfrew County, the list of victims continues to grow. This monument commemorates all the local women who over the decades died at the hands of their partners or ex-partners. 18 names in all, until September 22nd, when there'd be 3 more. Natalie Warmerdam, Anastasia Kuzik, Carol Kalatin. Their alleged killer, Basil Barutsky, a man everyone knew as violent. Neighbors, police, the courts, and yet no one was able to stop.
Something's wrong with our justice system. Something's wrong with people who didn't realize he's a serious offender when for years he's been beating women. Like, why didn't we know? Why didn't we acknowledge the seriousness of this person's violent behavior?
There are so many questions, and 4 months later, still so few answers. Where were the authorities, the police who had such a long history with him, the probation officers who were supposed to be monitoring him? How did he get away with openly breaking court orders? Why were women who had every right to be afraid of him not warned when he was released back into the community?
This crime is still mostly taken seriously after it's happened.
Amanda Dale heads one of Ontario's best-known women's advocacy centres. Of all the questions raised by the murders, she wonders most about the courts. How a man who was so often charged with hurting women so seldom got convicted. And why under our judicial system those charges can't be considered when it comes to sentencing.
I think it's time to sit down and consider enhanced prosecution techniques for these kinds of crimes.
How do you do that and still maintain the principle of innocent until proven guilty?
We have some sacred elements of legal process which fail women in these cases. We don't have huge numbers of wrongful convictions in these cases. We have problems getting convictions that keep women alive. You know, well-meaning adults who disagree could sit at a table and figure out, because we have enough information.
Why is that not happening? In 2015, why is that not happening?
I don't know. There's no reason for it to not happen.
What it takes, she says, what it's always taken, is political will. The Renfrew County murders happened in the middle of a federal election campaign, one day after what was supposed to have been a leaders' debate on women's issues. The debate was canceled after Stephen Harper and Thomas Mulcair pulled out. Neither they nor Justin Trudeau made a single public comment about what is now acknowledged to be the biggest multiple-partner domestic homicide in Canadian history. As for Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne, she tweeted her condolences.
Well, that's all well and good, but we saw this man coming, and the system did nothing. So thank you for the thoughts and prayers. But how about you roll up your sleeves and see what can be done so that this doesn't happen again? Make some inquiries. Do something. Because there are 3 families that have been absolutely devastated by this. And I don't want there to be any more.
Of course, when people die, ultimate responsibility can only lie with the killer. Basil Barutsky is still only an alleged murderer. Today he's in the Ottawa Detention Centre awaiting trial, though he is yet to enter a plea. 4 months ago, we made a request to speak with Barutsky.
Hello. Is this Mr. Barutsky?
This is.
And to our surprise, he called us back.
You have been charged with the murder of 3 women. We'd like to know if indeed you did murder them, and if so, why?
Nothing is quite that simple. There's a long story before we ever get to any part of that, there's a 20-year history here. I have been accused and accused and accused, and nobody has ever done anything on my behalf.
By now, his belief in his own victimhood was familiar to us. The cops had it in for him, the women too. There was a lot we needed to understand, he told us, but critically in our conversation, he did not deny the charges against him.
Mr. Brutsky, I want to ask you about what happened on September 22nd.
I just told you that the important part is what brought up to that. If you want to just play a game here and jump there and then judge me on that, there's no use us having a conversation.
Well, did you did you kill those women?
Are you asking me a question when I just told you that all this other stuff first has to be brought in the open? I think that maybe there should be an investigation into why the police didn't protect my rights as a human being. Why did they lay charges against me that were all wrong? Maybe then we could get to the point of why I'm frustrated and why all of this happened.
Well, why did it happen?
You're not listening, are you? You don't care to hear the real story, do you? Make an appointment to see me and talk to me for about 10 hours and understand before you judge me.
I'm not judging you, Mr. Brutsky.
Right,
I'm asking a question.
You're judging me.
Basil Borutsky is next scheduled to appear in court in 2 months' time. It could be years before his trial even begins. But a trial will never answer all of Renfrew County's questions, nor assuage all the blame. 3 women who needed protection in this community didn't get it. Their names now added to that monument, forever etched in stone. A question and an accusation. Why? Welcome back. Tonight our story focused on those tragic events in Ontario, but in many ways, domestic violence has become a silent killer in this country. So common we often don't even hear about the deaths, which now, on average, amount to 1 woman every 5 days killed by a partner or ex-partner. Since the deaths of Natalie and Anastasia and Carol on September 22nd, another 15 Canadian women have died from domestic violence. We thought it appropriate we share their names too.